Hello and welcome to Hyperpolyglotting with Elise. If you spend any time at all in language YouTube, one term you'll hear a lot is
comprehensible input, which is when
Comprehensible input.
Today of comprehensible input.
What is comprehensible input, or C?
Not receiving comprehensible input.
Comprehensible input versus
getting enough comprehensible input. And if
we're going to talk about comprehensible input.
Comprehensible input is the idea of
ways of providing comprehensible input to...
Most people call that comprehensible input.
Yes, comprehensible input. Everybody talks about it eventually. There's something of a disjointed debate in this space about whether it's actually as good as some people, myself included, say it is, or whether it's
total.
The frustrating thing about this discussion, though, is that a lot of it does a less than ideal job of explaining what this comprehensible input stuff actually is, and really engaging with the theory around it. I'll admit, I haven't always been great at this myself. The actual theoretical works on comprehensible input and the input hypothesis have long been on my miles-long reading list, but I've never really got round to reading all that much about it, for what I think is the understandable reason that I never actually had to be convinced of the value of input. I was relying on input-centric methods of my own devising to acquire languages years before I'd ever heard of Stephen Krashen or the input hypothesis. Decades, really. I've been using input-related methods, really, since the 1990s, to at least some extent, because I realized they were getting results that other, more conventional methods didn't. So, when I first heard about Krashen and the research around comprehensible input, the surprise was not that there was this amazing new approach to learning languages, but that other people were apparently learning languages in ways very similar to the ways I was using, and that there was actually a theoretical apparatus backing it up. Nobody ever had to make the case for comprehensible input to me, so reading the evidence in favor of it was not really a priority. Until now. This week on stream, we looked at a deeply frustrating reaction video.
And again, if you're speaking those things and you know what they mean, then that is comprehensible, and it is a form of input.
Yeah, but that's not... Again, okay, this is actually really annoying. Like, this is, like, I mean, if you're going to engage with scientific work, you do have to actually know what the terms mean.
I think that the input hypothesis has errors and negatively affects millions of people trying to learn a language. I have an obligation to talk about it.
Okay, I should have just let him finish his sentence.
Yeah, I mean, this is the griftiest shit ever. And it's really something that, I have to say, Evil D has been doing these things where it's like, is this person a fraud or something like that? And this isn't setting his grift meter, this isn't like burying the needle of the fraudometer that somebody is using, somebody's talking this way, doing this sort of positioning and stuff like that. I have to say, you missed it. And I mean, I'm getting the feeling, just from listening to both of them talk, that neither of them have engaged with this work. They've watched YouTube videos. That is not how you engage with scientific work.
But my issues with this type of belief system, where all you need is input and nothing else, is the fact that people...
I mean, if I say that you need that a fire will only occur if there is sufficient oxygen available to make the fire happen, I'm not saying that oxygen is all you need. I'm saying that without the oxygen, it doesn't fucking matter what else you've got set up there. You might have a perfect setup, the oxygen, but without the oxygen, you're not going to have a fire.
Because even little children, we're talking babies, they don't just sit there silently, passively listening.
Actually, for a while they do, though. For a while they are not making concerted attempts at making language sounds. I mean, this is, again, a key part of the research. There is this silent receptive period. People start talking at different ages.
No. As soon as they can form the most basic of sounds, they try to communicate. And then they get corrected via, their environment.
That's not how that works. Like, what, who the fuck is, like, okay, so you have, like, a, 1 month old baby makes some sort of random sound. What kind of fucked up parents are correcting them?
So the idea that we should just wait until we're already highly proficient in listening to a language before we speak would be the equivalent of a kid waiting until, a couple of years old before they start speaking.
That is literally what happens, though.
This is interesting. I'm starting to look at this guy through the eyes of a teacher. Now, I say that because most, polyglot YouTubers and stuff online, they talk about languages, and by the way, I don't claim to be a polyglot. Most of these guys, they look at it from the perspective of, someone who has learnt languages, for pleasure, maybe for business or something.
The learner's perspective is precisely what is missing amongst most teachers, particularly teachers of English, which is precisely why they fall for a lot of empirically debunked approaches to language pedagogy.
So Krashen's ideas are correct. However, is either he doesn't know how to enunciate his ideas correctly.
Fucking hell. He doesn't enunciate he's a scientist. He doesn't enunciate his ideas in YouTube videos. He writes it he does studies and puts them in peer-reviewed journals. If you want to hear him enunciating his ideas, you gotta read that stuff. That's
an error correction. I don't know why he said that's not going to help you learn a language.
Oh, well, he said that because he studied this shit. Actually, again, scientific work, fucking read it if you're going to critique it. They've done studies on, whether explicit error correction actually results in people making the errors less. It doesn't. It literally doesn't. This is so unfortunate. And this is so unnecessary. If you're going to actually react, you're going to actually talk about somebody's scientific work, engage with it, please.
I have one beef with the term acquire a language because what does it mean? You just...
Oh, well, I mean, again, this is not something you have to speculate about. Go look at the fucking scientific work. Yeah, let me find. I'm sure if I go, let's see, Krashen language acquisition research, we'll find his definition. In it, Evil D was reacting to the based and Dunning-Kruger build Canguro English's bold claim that
there's just one little problem with the input hypothesis. It's total.
I'd already watched and reacted to Canguro English's video months ago, so I knew that Canguro, interpreting his performance with maximum charity, doesn't know anything about the input hypothesis.
The main reason this idea is so powerful is due to the influence of one man.
Okay, one man and all of... Okay, this is already just silly. Yes, one guy is sort of the face of this 40 years of research, but he's not the only one doing the research. Lots of people are doing the research. Because the thing about comprehensible input is it is not a method. It is a process that goes on in what is known to researchers as the language acquisition device, which is to say, all of the bits of the brain that are in some way involved in language acquisition. So, comprehensible input is the thing that you use, the method that allows you, the method can be all sorts of things. The key is that that element is there.
is that the hypothesis can immediately be shown to be false by a specific but very common group of people called receptive bilinguals. They are people who have a highly proficient understanding of language, but they cannot speak.
Okay, this is already nonsense. Because the input hypothesis actually accounts for what he's calling receptive bilinguals. Because what it points out is that in language acquisition, whether it's your very first language that you're learning in infancy and early childhood, or a second language, there's always what's called a silent period, and it takes varying amounts of time to get there. To overcome that silent period. I mean, people this input.
It's not an accident that people call themselves English speakers or Japanese speakers.
Wow, checkmate, language acquisition researchers. You didn't consider that people talk.
I wonder how many learners would believe in a teacher that says, "In my classroom, you will learn to acquire language, but not produce it."
Fucking hell. Like, the definition of acquisition includes the ability to produce it. You dickhead.
Let's do a thought experiment. So,
we're gonna watch him experiment with thinking. However, I was rather disappointed to find that Evil D's performance indicated that he didn't even know the most basic things about it either. The thing about this is, Krashen's seminal works on the subject are not hard to find. He doesn't believe in paywalling science, so he puts all his publications up on his website as PDFs. For free! You don't even have to register for anything. You'll find the link in the description, and I really, really, really can't emphasize enough that people ought to just check them out. His writing is quite accessible, and he tends to do a very good job of explaining his terms. Okay, what does it mean to acquire language? Is that the same thing as learning a language? What about understanding messages? What is this comprehensible input, and why would anyone think that that's the key ingredient in language acquisition? Canguro treats this like it's some kind of mystery, as if we were left to speculate about the meaning of such central terms in second language acquisition theory. Evil D, alas, doesn't do any better, though he does come a bit closer to accurately guessing the meaning of these terms. In the interest of improving the quality of the discussion in this space and making this theoretical work even more accessible, I'm going to answer those questions here and now, using Krashen's Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, originally published in 1982, and re-released about 20 years later with updated citations and a few minor modifications. The main one being that in 1982, Krashen had thought that it would be useful to sort of mislead students about what they were actually doing, and 20 years later, he revised that and came to the conclusion that it was better to actually spell out exactly what this method was about, so that the students would know exactly what they were doing and what the point of it was. So, what does it mean to acquire language? Is that the same thing as learning a language? In everyday speech, we tend to speak of learning a language the way we speak of learning any other new thing. We're generally focused on the outcome, in this case, the ability to actually use the language, rather than the process. So, learning tends to include the concept of acquiring. However, I'm going to refer, but they're not the same thing. I am, however, going to refer to the person engaging in both of those processes as a learner, just because I find it sounds less awkward than acquirer. in the scientific literature on language acquisition, they are two very different things. The acquisition-learning distinction is perhaps the most fundamental of all the hypotheses to be presented here. It states that adults have two distinct and independent ways of developing competence in a second language. The first way is language acquisition, a process similar, if not identical, to the way children develop ability in their first language. Language acquisition is a subconscious process. Language learners are not usually aware of the fact that they are acquiring language, but are only aware of the fact that they are using the language for communication. The result of language acquisition, acquired competence, is also subconscious. We are generally not consciously aware of the rules of the languages we have acquired. Instead, we have a feel for correctness. Grammatical sentences sound right, or they feel right, and errors feel wrong, even if we do not consciously know what rule was violated. Other ways of describing acquisition include implicit learning, informal learning, and natural learning. In non-technical language, acquisition is picking up a language. The second way to develop competence in a second language is by language learning. We will use the term learning henceforth to refer to conscious knowledge of a second language, knowing the rules, being aware of them, and being able to talk about them. In non-technical terms, learning is knowing about a language, known to most people as grammar or rules. Some synonyms include formal knowledge of a language or explicit learning. So, in other words, learning a language in this terminology means learning what the subjunctive is and how you form it, or the mode coniugiach, or whatever. Understanding the word order for relative clauses, the person who, the thing that. Understanding grammatical gender, and all sorts of other formal rules that you can find in grammar books. The thing about human language is that these formally described rules are just the tip of the iceberg. Linguists are constantly discovering new rules about how languages work that most native speakers, even those who actually teach the language, never even think about. Often, the only way native speakers even become aware of a lot of these rules is when a non-native speaker blows their mind by asking them a question they never even thought about. Why do you always put adjectives in that order in English? Huh? Speakers acquire these rules without even knowing that they are rules, without formally learning them, quite simply because every bit of input in the language that they're exposed to follows them. There's no error correction here because basically nobody ever gets them wrong. And because no native speaker ever gets them wrong, very few native speakers are even aware of them. It just feels right to say things one way and feels wrong to say them another way. And acquisition is the process by which the instinct for that is developed. So, in other words, when Krashen and other theorists and practitioners of language acquisition say that we acquire language through comprehensible input, they're talking about the process of developing this unconscious feel for how a language works. Since this instinct operates unconsciously and is developed unconsciously, it's not something that can be formally taught in the normal sense, just coaxed along with the right kind of input in the right sort of setting. So, what exactly is this comprehensible input? Now, to answer this, it's worth looking at something called the natural order hypothesis in the same book. But only briefly, don't worry, we are going to stay more or less on track. One of the most exciting discoveries in language acquisition research in recent years, recent that is from the 1982 perspective, has been the finding that the acquisition of grammatical structures proceeds in a predictable order. Learners of a given language tend to acquire certain grammatical structures early and others later. The agreement among individual learners is not always 100%, but there are clear, statistically significant similarities. The book discusses the research that led to this finding in some detail, but the important bit for our purposes here is that language acquisition, both first language acquisition in children and the acquisition of other languages later in life, tends to follow predictable stages. People pick up certain structures early on and advance to other structures later. In the table that I've got up here, you can see examples of how that looks in the case of English, which was at the time one of two languages, the other being Russian, that had been studied in detail for these sorts of patterns. One imagines that since then there's been quite a bit more research along those lines, but this is 1982, and a lot of this stuff was new at the time. The question the input hypothesis seeks to answer is, how do we move from one stage to another? If a learner is at stage 4, how can he progress to stage 5? More generally, how do we move from stage I, where I represents current competence, to I+1, the next level? The input hypothesis makes the following claim. A necessary, but not sufficient, condition to move from stage I to stage I+1 is that the learner understand input that contains I+1, where understand means that the learner is focused on the meaning and not the form of the message. In other words, we're not talking about any old input when we talk about the power of comprehensible input. We're not just talking about sitting in front of anime and expecting that that in itself is going to give you Japanese, competence in Japanese. We're talking about input in the target language that contains aspects of the language the learner doesn't have yet. For example, someone in the early stages of English might have acquired the progressive ending, ing, the plural, and to be, but not articles, and the, or the use of to be informing the progressive. That is the next stage, according to the table that we have up here. So, comprehensible input for somebody in this stage would be input that the learner understands the meaning of and contains those structures that they don't have yet. Say, a brilliant, daring, turmeric-stained Cornish seagull is stealing Bob's chips. Bob is trying to negotiate with the seagull. The seagull is not impressed. Bob is not eating chips today. In fact, I mean, in a classroom using an input-based method like TPRS would end up using, they would be producing a story, and that story might include elements like this. In fact, that's one of the cool things about TPRS-based methods, the whole storytelling thing, is that you get this weird-ass freewheeling story that is initiated to some extent by the teacher, but everybody else is keeping it going by adding whatever they can think of in their target language to move it along. We acquire, in other words, only when we understand language that contains structure that is a little beyond where we are now. How is this possible? How can we understand language that contains structures that we have not yet acquired? The answer to this apparent paradox is that we use more than our linguistic competence to help us understand. We also use context, our knowledge of the world, our extra-linguistic information to help us understand language directed at us. In other words, we understand these aspects of our target language that we haven't acquired yet because they're placed in a context where we can make sense out of the meaning anyway. For example, there might be pictures or video to illustrate that the stealing of the chips, the failed negotiation, and the ensuing chip loss is a process that's ongoing as it's being narrated. In fact, this is precisely the sort of thing that you would find in a TPRS-based classroom. This, incidentally, is why it makes absolutely no sense to refer to a learner's own target language speech as a type of comprehensible input for the learner. By definition, the input we're talking about includes structures that the learner has not yet acquired. Those structures, obviously, have to come from someone else who already has them. Well, okay, so what about speech? All this has been so far about passively taking in input. How does speech come into that? And what about these
receptive bilinguals?
Surely they prove that this doesn't work. One of the things that language acquisition research has shown over the years is that learners, whether they're acquiring their first language or an additional one, have what is known as a silent period, where their engagement with the target language is passive, taking it in, absorbing it without producing much other than maybe a few memorized words and phrases. There's no way to force an end to this period. It ends when the learner is ready. In accordance with the input hypothesis, speaking ability emerges on its own after enough competence has been developed by listening and understanding. In Principles and Practices, Krashen reviews a number of comparative studies of teaching methods that allow learners a silent period, and more conventional approaches, like those marketed by Canguro English, that do not. They found that allowing learners a silent period results in superior competence both in comprehension and in the spontaneous speech that ultimately emerged, to forcing early speech. Now, what Canguro is doing when he offers receptive bilinguals as some sort of rebuttal to whatever he imagines the input hypothesis is merely essentializing the silent period rather than recognizing it as what it is, a phase of language acquisition that is overcome when the learner has had enough comprehensible input for speech to emerge on its own. That is why it is significant that these receptive bilinguals are receptively bilingual in an environment where the language they are receptive only in is not the language in common everyday use outside of their homes. They're not being bombarded with all sorts of comprehensible input outside of a very narrow environment, so their knowledge of languages, of the two languages that they have grown up with, is lopsided as a result. Obviously, once speech has emerged, the more opportunities a learner has to speak in a conducive environment, the better they'll get at it. Nobody seriously claims otherwise. The point here is that forcing speech early on demonstrably does not contribute to the process. At most, it results in stereotype memorized phrases, produced mechanically without any associated ability to vary them creatively and spontaneously. Anything more than this will only emerge once enough language has been acquired to overcome the silent period. Canguro and Evil D declare themselves big believers in error correction. As it happens, I'm also big into error correction in some contexts where it's useful. That's why I'm making this video. And that's why I'm going to talk about an error that is unfortunately very common amongst foreign language teachers. The notion that correcting learners does anyone any good. Closely related to speaking readiness for production is the question of error and error correction. Second language acquisition research tells us clearly that errors are inevitable and that they will be plentiful in early stages. A sure method of raising the filter is attempting to correct errors, especially in beginning stages and especially in spoken language. Error correction is unfortunately the profession's typical reaction to error, and in my view, it has been a serious mistake. There are several reasons why it is a mistake. We focus here on what is probably the most serious flaw in error correction. Its effect of, that should be on, the affective filter. Error correction has the immediate effect of putting the student on the defensive. It encourages a strategy in which the student will try to avoid mistakes, avoid difficult constructions, focus less on meaning and more on form. It may disrupt the entire communicative focus on an exchange. Wait, back up. What's this filter Krashen's on about? Well, in short, the affective filter refers to psychological barriers to language acquisition. In particular, those relating to motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety. Second language acquisition theory refers to this as a filter because it's not part of the language acquisition device itself, but it can cause input to stop short of engaging with it. The weaker the learner's motivation and the greater their anxiety, the stronger the filter. The stronger the filter, the less likely input's going to be used for language acquisition. The input hypothesis and the concept of the affective filter define the language teacher in a new way. The effective language teacher is someone who can provide input and help make it comprehensible in a low anxiety situation. Of course, many teachers have felt this way about their task for years, at least until they were told otherwise by the experts. So, let's say a learner is saying something in their target language. They get their idea across, but they make a few mistakes that are typical of their level of competence. Teacher has two basic options. Respond to what the learner is trying to say, thus providing more comprehensible input and encouraging further engagement. Or, 2, correct the errors, thus interrupting the flow of the conversation, taking the focus away from the meaning, and making the learner self-conscious and more hesitant to speak going forward for fear of making more errors. In both cases, the immediate effect on the likelihood of making more typical errors is the same. Nil. Learners are going to make mistakes, and those mistakes are going to be consistent with the degree to which they've acquired the target language. They'll get better at using the structures they're getting wrong when they've had enough input to acquire those structures accurately. One key way to ensure that they keep getting more and more comprehensible input is to encourage them to keep talking, since their speech, however halting or error-laden, will elicit input in response. However, active error correction actually makes it less likely that the learner will eventually improve, since it will raise the affective filter by making the learner more anxious and self-conscious, more focused on structures and form, and as a result probably less likely to talk, and certainly less likely to experiment and do anything they aren't already extremely confident with. Now we've addressed the theory, I'd like to briefly touch on practice. Both Evil D and Canguro English seem completely and utterly unaware that input-based classroom approaches even exist, let alone what they look like. Listening to them, you could easily come away with the idea that the input hypothesis is completely agnostic on the subject. I wonder if Krashen has had anything to say about it. Oh, of course he has. The classroom will probably never be able to completely overcome its limitations. By which Krashen means the fact that there's always going to be much more input available in the real world that can ever be provided in a classroom setting. Nor does it have to. Its goal is not to substitute for the outside world, but to bring students to the point where they can begin to use the outside world for further acquisition, to where they can begin to understand the language used on the outside. It does this in two ways. By supplying input so that students progress in language acquisition, so that they understand real language to at least some extent, and by making the student conversationally competent. That is, by giving the student tools to manage conversations despite a less than perfect competence in the second language. More specifically, he writes, if we are correct in positing comprehensibility as a crucial requirement for optimal input for acquisition, the question of how to aid comprehension is a very central one for second language pedagogy. Indeed, the comprehension requirement suggests that the main function of the second language teacher is to help make input comprehensible, to do for the adult what the outside world cannot or will not do. There are basically two ways in which this teacher can aid comprehension, linguistic and non-linguistic. Studies have shown that there are many things speakers do linguistically to make their speech more comprehensible to less competent speakers. Hatch, 1979, has summarized the linguistic aspect of simplified input, which appears to promote comprehension. Among these characteristics are 1. Slower rate and clearer articulation, which helps acquirers to identify word boundaries more easily and allows more processing time. 2. More use of high-frequency vocabulary, less slang, fewer idioms. 3. Syntactic simplification, shorter sentences. Elsewhere, under other features that encourage acquisition, Gratian writes about the importance of an environment and teaching methods that do not, quote, put the student on the defensive, including by not insisting on making students speak before they are ready. Language teachers and students associate progress in second language acquisition with speaking fluency. Do you speak French? And the logical consequence of this is that we want our students to talk from the beginning. My personal view is that forcing early production before the student has built up enough competence through comprehensible input is perhaps the single most anxiety-provoking thing about language classes. While some students may want to talk as soon as possible, others may feel less secure until they have built up more competence. In other words, the length of the silent period is variable. Asher's 10-hour estimate may be average, but it is not carved in stone. A safe procedure is simply not to force production, and let the student decide when to start talking. So, what does an input-based classroom look like? Examples abound right here on YouTube. One suggested search term is language name TPRS.
他不在家，他在酒吧。
Uomo. Questo è un uomo. Uomo. Questo è un uomo. Donna. Questa è una donna. Donna. Questa è una donna. Si amano. Si amano. Allora si sposano. Matrimonio.
Αυτή είναι μια οικογένεια. Αυτός είναι ο μπαμπάς. Αυτή είναι η мама.
Магазин за продуктами. Я хотел приготовить мой любимый рис со специями и овощами.
이 볼드모트는 코가 없어요. 코가 없어요. 태웅이는 코가 있어요. 그리고 이 볼드모트는 머리카락이 없어요.
Vaya, ¿cómo van a viajar Iva y Yoko Ono de Nueva York a Tíbet? No. ¿Van a viajar en máquina teletransportadora?
No.
Es muy fácil.
Mach auf, schau rein. Der Küchenschrank. Das ist ein Küchenschrank. Und was sehen wir hier? Wir sehen viel Geschirr. Und diese Worte kennst du bestimmt. Hier sind Teller. Das hier sind flache Teller. Zum Beispiel für Brot. Das
마페가 오고 오다. kwakho okuthengelwe wena.
Yebo.
Wena imali yakho iphelile. Abantwana bakho abahlanu bayahlanya? Cha. Yebo.
The material I'm using here comes from a great channel called Zamani Zulu, which uses input-based methods to help learners acquire isiZulu. Zamani Zulu is operated by Bryan, who himself started learning the language by conventional methods, the sort of methods Krashen and other input theorists would refer to as language learning rather than language acquisition, at university.
So you mentioned that you started teaching Zulu with the traditional approach first, and then you have the aha moment, right?
Yes. Grammar. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you feel the difference? I mean, in your students' experience right away, like could you see that right away? Like they were having so much fun as opposed to previously, and the amount of Zulu they were acquiring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just my own experience through learning Zulu through grammar was I could sort of speak Zulu at the end of 3 years of varsity. But a dear friend of mine said to me once, he's like, Bryan, you speak Zulu well, but you sound like a machine gun. All this English is all on the beat. But isiZulu usikhuluma kanje. It's a bit of a song and a flow to it. So my pronunciation was way off because I'd read it, and it's just everything's Zulu grammar is very nice for learning through grammar learning, because it's very modular. You stick things onto each other and there's very little that changes. So this is what was in my brain, this plus this plus this, and this is what I'd be doing when trying to have conversations with people, because I'd say hello and then not listen to what they're saying, because no, I have now got to put recent past compound tense plus the object plus the verb. And I can say my sentence. Bengifunda izolo. I was studying yesterday, but I haven't listened to what they've just been telling me. And I say, I was studying yesterday. And people are like, okay, this has got nothing to do with what I was saying. Great. And then they, say something else, but I'm not listening again. Okay, this plus this. So that was my experience, and luckily I didn't teach very long with the grammar way. But yeah, the first lesson, I remember the first lesson I taught that next day that I was talking about, that I just took a clip from Lion King. Zazu was the character, and we just spoke about Zazu and just acted it out, and it was chaos, but
good chaos.
Fun.
Good chaos.
It was good chaos, I hope. Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, cool.
So definitely, as you say, the change. I mean, the one thing from Krashen's, I think Krashen's quote as well was a bad CI class is always better than a good grammar class.
Correct.
Which is very cool. Yeah.
Because it's way closer to real life acquisition of language, right? Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was when you were talking about your experience with Zulu, that you just say hello to somebody, and while they were speaking, you were trying to consciously think about what you want to say next, and you're not paying attention to what they're saying. I mean, it sounds,
it's not the point of.
It sounds crazy, but that's pretty much what we all did after grammar classes, right?
Yeah.
Having both experienced the deficiencies of the conventional skills-based approaches and the power of comprehensible input firsthand, here's how Bryan helps learners acquire isiZulu. There are a number of things to notice here. For one thing, check out the wall behind Bryan. You've got all sorts of helpful information, useful phrases, and the like, in order to make it easier for the learners to join in. If they don't know a word they need, they can just look right up at the board and find the isiZulu for how do you say X in isiZulu. which for anyone interested is Ngingasho kanjani ukutsi x ngesiZulu. You can see it to the bottom right on the top bit above the whiteboard there. The idea here is to encourage production without actually forcing anyone to produce before they're ready. And since a lot of the time people are not going to have the words that they need in order to make the to produce the sort of thing that they want to, this allows them, these phrases and the other information allow them to acquire the information that they need in order to say the things that they're trying to say. These are also, it's worth noting, the kinds of conversation management strategies that Krashen is talking about. Conversation management being things like being able to point out when you don't understand in your target language, being able to ask for help with saying things that you don't quite know how to say in your target language, stuff like that. You know, speak slower, I didn't quite get that, all that kind of stuff. So Bryan gets the story going, introducing the main characters, and sets out the general idea of the thing. And then he solicits contributions from the students. The idea here is a free-form story that is initially framed by the teacher, but that the students can take anywhere they want. I've participated in classes organized in this way, in Arabic at the online polyglot gathering last year, and they're both very useful and a lot of fun. The input is made interesting by the fact that the students can shape the story in whatever way they see fit, and the information on the board helps keep things flowing without people having to move out of the target language. There's no judging of people's language production, which helps lower the affective filter. People produce what they can produce, and the response is based on meaning rather than form, meaning that every attempt at producing isiZulu will elicit further comprehensible input, and thus move everyone in the direction of further acquisition of the language. Drongo English, of course, is in direct competition with people who offer courses like this, whether he's aware of them or not. So he has kind of a direct interest in encouraging people to dismiss the entire underlying idea. Evil D, on the other hand, seems to be totally unaware that this sort of thing even exists. That makes the whole experience of watching this reaction video feel a bit like punishment for knowing it all about this stuff. To recap, though, the input hypothesis is not just sit and watch anime and you'll eventually speak Japanese, mate. The input hypothesis says that we acquire language when we are able, through extra-linguistic factors like visual context or our general knowledge, to understand input that includes aspects of the language that we have not acquired yet. It distinguishes between learning a language, where you're taught grammar rules and verb forms and the like, from acquiring a language, which is largely an unconscious process by which a learner develops an instinct for how the language works. Speech in this view is not something that can be forced. The silent period will end on its own when the learner has had enough input to be able to attempt production, and that production will in turn elicit input that will aid in further acquisition. Comprehensible input is not a method. It is a necessary ingredient, one of several, for the process of language acquisition. Another key ingredient is an environment that minimizes stress and anxiety, in which the learner is not put on the defensive and made to feel self-conscious about their eventual efforts at production. And the role of the teacher is to help lay the foundation by methods like what we saw a moment ago with Bryan of Zamani Zulu, that will allow students to transition as smoothly as possible to relying on real-world sources of input in an unstructured setting to guide their further language acquisition. That's the input hypothesis, not what either of these two seems to think it is. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on my Patreon. The plagiarism-fueled garbage machine marketed as AI has been particularly damaging to my profession, translation. As such, contributions to support my work, including the Ines Armand translation project with either a paid subscription or a one-off donation, see the links in the description, are a real lifeline to me. I'm trying to raise just over another $2,600 to cover the cost of translating and editing the long overlooked works of Alexandra Kollonthai's predecessor, Ines Armand, and your support is much appreciated. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon on the stream at 4:30 p.m. US Eastern Time on Fridays and Saturdays.